The Morning Forbes named Malcolm Hurst the most influential investor in Western Canada. He was sitting alone in a hospital hallway, staring at a paper cup of cold coffee and trying to remember the last time he had slept. That was 3 weeks ago. He hadn't slept properly since. His son's name was Callum, 11 years old, dark hair, gap-toothed smile, obsessed with hockey and terrible at math, and so relentlessly, exhaustingly alive that Malcolm used to joke the boy burned more energy in one morning than most adults managed in a week. Used to joke, past tense, because now Callum lay in a bed in room 14B at Vancouver General Hospital, and he hadn't opened his eyes in 26 days. The doctors had a name for it. They always had a name for things. Progressive Neurological Disruption Syndrome, PNDS, a degenerative condition affecting the brain's communication pathways, triggered, they believed, by a virus that had seemed ordinary enough at first. A fever, some fatigue. Malcolm had assumed it was a cold and told Callum to rest and drink water, and missed 2 days of his son's deterioration because he'd been in Calgary closing a deal worth $40 million. He would spend the rest of his life not forgiving himself for that. Mr. Hurst. Dr. Amara Osi stepped out of the room and closed the door quietly behind her. She was a neurologist, brilliant and precise, and Malcolm had come to dread the particular way she folded her hands when she was about to say something she didn't want to say. She was folding them now. "We've completed the second round of assessments." And she was quiet for a moment in the way that doctors are quiet when silence is kinder than words. "The neural pathways we identified as most critical, the ones controlling voluntary movement and conscious response, they're continuing to deteriorate, slowly but consistently." She met his eyes. "Malcolm, we've tried every intervention currently available to us." The specialist from Toronto confirmed the same conclusion Dr. Park reached last week. "At this stage, we can keep Callum comfortable, we can monitor him, we can hope for spontaneous stabilization, but we cannot reverse what's already happened, and we cannot stop what's continuing to happen." The hallway felt very narrow. Malcolm pressed his back against the wall. "What does that mean?" he said. Not a question, really. More like something a person says to fill the space where the world used to be. "It means we need to talk about long-term care options," Dr. Osi said gently. "There are excellent facilities. Malcolm, no facilities. He's not going anywhere." He looked through the window in the door at his son's still face. "He stays here, or he comes home. But he's not going somewhere to." He stopped. "I'm not sending him away." Dr. Osi nodded slowly. She'd expected this. She understood it. She didn't argue. What she didn't say, and what Malcolm already knew, was that bringing Callum home meant accepting a certain kind of ending. Comfortable, quiet, irreversible. His ex-wife, Nadine, arrived that afternoon. She'd flown from Montreal the moment he'd called, and she sat beside Callum's bed for 2 hours without speaking, holding their son's hand the way you hold onto something you can feel slipping. She and Malcolm hadn't been kind to each other in the years since the divorce. There had been too many missed visits, too many phone calls that ended badly, too much bitterness stored up in the spaces between them. But in that room, none of that existed. They were just two people who loved the same boy. "There has to be something," Nadine said finally. Her voice was flat and careful, the voice of someone who has been crying so long they've run out of a different way to sound. "I've spoken to people in Toronto, Boston, London," Malcolm said. "I paid a team in Switzerland to review his file. They all said the same thing." Nadine pressed her lips together, looked at Callum, looked away. Outside room 14B, the hospital went on doing what hospitals do, beeping and rolling and murmuring, and Malcolm sat down in the chair beside his son and thought about a hockey game they'd watched together in February, how Callum had yelled so loud the neighbors had knocked on the wall, and how Malcolm had laughed instead of shushing him. He would give every dollar he had to hear that again, every single one. The girl showed up on a Tuesday. Malcolm noticed her first in the family waiting area down the hall, a small figure curled in one of the orange vinyl chairs with a book open across her knees, though she didn't seem to be reading it. She looked about 10 or 11, with brown skin and thick braids tied back with a yellow elastic, and she wore a coat that was slightly too large for her, the cuffs folded back twice to free her hands. She was there when he arrived in the morning. She was there when he stepped out for coffee. She was still there at 7 in the evening. On the third day he stopped. "Are you here by yourself?" She looked up. She had careful eyes, the kind that take in more than they let on. My mother's working, she said. She's a cleaner here. Night shift. She lets me come after school and wait. Malcolm nodded. He'd seen the cleaning staff moving through the halls in their green uniforms, quiet and invisible the way hospitals make people invisible when they're not patients or doctors. What are you reading? She tilted the cover toward him. It was a book on traditional plant medicine, dense text, hand-drawn illustrations. Far too advanced for a child her age, he would have thought, except that she clearly hadn't thought so. My grandmother gave it to me, she said, before she passed. She used to be a healer in Guyana. She knew things about plants that she stopped as if she'd decided she'd said enough to a stranger. Her name was Simone, her mother was Claudette. They'd come to Vancouver 4 years ago, and they lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in East Vancouver that Claudette paid for by working 2 jobs, one of which was this one. Malcolm learned all of this gradually over the following days, in the way you learn things about a person when you keep ending up in the same hallway. Simone was not a child who offered information freely. She watched first, assessed, answered when she decided a question deserved answering. On the 5th day, she asked him why he was always staring at room 14B. He told her about Callum. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual, and when he finished she was quiet for a long moment. What do the doctors say his brain is doing? She asked. It was such a precise question that Malcolm blinked. He explained, in simplified terms, what Dr. Osei had described, the pathways, the disruption, the brain's failing attempt to reroute its own signals. Simone nodded slowly. Then she said, "My grandmother used to say that sometimes when a path is blocked, you don't clear the path, you make a new one." Malcolm looked at her. "She treated a man in our village," Simone continued quietly, still looking at her book, who couldn't move his left side after a stroke. The doctors in Georgetown said there was nothing to do. She used pressure points and sound, specific frequencies, she said, and she made him move the affected limbs every day even when he couldn't feel them, because she said the body needs to remember the movement even if the brain has forgotten how to ask for it. She paused. He walked again. Not perfectly, but he walked. The hallway was very quiet. She documented everything, Simone said. "I have her notebooks." Malcolm said nothing for a moment. Then, "How old are you?" 11, and you believe what's in those notebooks." She met his eyes with the particular directness of a child who has learned that adults often mistake her for someone who doesn't know things. "I believe my grandmother healed people," she said, simply. "I saw it. He didn't act on it immediately. Of course he didn't. He was a man who had built a life on evidence, on metrics, on the kind of thinking that required data before it permitted hope." He told himself the girl was 11 and her grandmother was gone, and anecdotes from a village in Guyana were not the same as clinical trials. But he kept thinking about what she'd said. That night he sat beside Callum and he looked at his son's hands, still pale, resting on the blanket like something abandoned, and he thought about neural pathways and blocked roads and a boy who had once yelled at a hockey game loud enough to shake the walls. He went back to Simone the next morning. "Would your mother be willing to speak with me?" he asked. Simone studied him. Whatever she was measuring, he seemed to pass. "I'll ask her," she said. Claudette Beaumont was a quiet woman with a steady handshake and the kind of dignity that comes not from money or position, but from having withstood difficult things with your principles intact. She met Malcolm in the hospital cafeteria during her break. Still in her green uniform, her hair tied back. She brought Simone's grandmother's notebooks in a canvas bag. She was not impressed by Malcolm's name or his money. He could tell immediately, and it made him like her. "I want you to understand something," she said, setting the bag on the table but not opening it. "My mother spent 40 years healing people. She kept records because she was precise, not because she wanted anyone to publish them. I'm showing you these because Simone asked me to, and I trust my daughter's judgment." A pause. "Not because I want anything from you." "I understand," Malcolm said. "I'm not sure you do," Claudette said, not unkindly. "Men in your position are accustomed to buying solutions. This isn't something you can buy. If we try any of this, and I haven't said we will, it will be because I believe it might help your son, not because you can pay for it." Malcolm sat with that for a moment. "Then what do I need to do?" Claudette looked at him for a long time. "You need to be willing to not be in charge," she said. "That might be harder for you than anything else." She was right. It was. The hospital's reaction was precisely what Malcolm had expected and prepared for. Dr. Osi listened with careful professionalism and said that while she respected traditional medicine in principle, she could not endorse unverified interventions for a patient in Callum's condition. The head of neurology was more blunt. Legal needed to be involved if they were going to allow anything non-standard to take place in the facility. There were forms, there were conversations that were really arguments conducted in the language of institutional concern. Malcolm had not become what he was by accepting the first no he received. He documented everything Claudette showed him. He had it reviewed by 2 independent physicians who specialized in rehabilitation medicine. Neither of them dismissed it outright, which was more than he'd expected. He found literature, buried in journals and ethnobotanical studies, supporting several of the specific techniques Simone's grandmother had used. The auditory stimulation, the deliberate passive movement of unresponsive limbs, the specific pressure points along the cervical spine. It took 11 days and more legal wrangling than he would ever admit to Claudette, but eventually a supervised trial was approved. Limited, carefully monitored, documented at every step. Claudette arrived on a Monday morning with her mother's notebooks and a small bag of things. Simone came too, because Claudette said the child understood the methods better than anyone, and because Simone had asked to come and Claudette did not dismiss her daughter's knowledge simply because of her age. Malcolm stood in the corner of room 14B and watched. What Claudette did was quiet and unhurried. She moved Callum's limbs slowly, deliberately, speaking to him in a low voice as she did, telling him what she was doing, where she was touching, what she wanted his body to remember. She applied pressure to specific points along his neck and shoulders. She used a small tuning fork held near his ears, a particular frequency, sustained for intervals Simone timed with a stopwatch. She placed his hands in warm water and moved his fingers one by one. It was nothing like what the machines did. It looked, to Malcolm's eyes, almost like tenderness. He had to leave the room twice. He told himself it was to take calls. It wasn't. The first session ended with nothing visibly changed. Dr. Osi reviewed the monitoring data and found no significant variation. The neurologist from the oversight team wrote, "No acute response observed," in his notes. Malcolm drove home at 11 o'clock at night and sat in his kitchen in the dark for a long time. Claudette came back Wednesday and Friday, the following Monday and Wednesday again. On the 9th day, during a Friday morning session, Simone was timing a tuning fork interval, and Malcolm was standing by the window pretending to look at his phone, and Callum's right hand moved, not a tremor. His fingers curled slowly, incompletely, but deliberately, around the edge of the blanket. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Simone said very quietly, "Callum, can you do that again?" A pause. 5 seconds. 10. And Callum's fingers moved again. Malcolm made a sound that he had not made since he was a child. He pressed his hand over his mouth and turned toward the window, and stood there with his shoulders shaking until he could trust himself to turn back around. Dr. Osi was called. She stood at the bedside and ran the assessment, and then ran it again, and then stood very still in a way that Malcolm had not seen from her before. "That's," she started, stopped. "That's a voluntary motor response." "Yes," Claudette said. Dr. Osi looked at the notebooks on the chair, looked at Callum, looked at Claudette. "I'd like to understand what you did," she said finally. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was something. Recovery was not the word for what happened next, not in the dramatic, sudden sense that word implies. It was slower than that, more uncertain. More like watching something grow than watching something switch on. Callum began responding to sound first, turning his head slightly, the faintest change in his breathing when Malcolm spoke to him. Then came the finger movements, more consistently, more controlled. Then on a Thursday morning in March, he opened his eyes. Not for long, a few seconds. But he looked at Malcolm, and Malcolm, who had not cried in front of another person in 20 years, cried. The neurology team was, to their credit, genuinely interested. Dr. Osi spent hours with Claudette going through the notebooks, asking careful questions, taking notes. She published nothing without Claudette's explicit permission and involvement. She was honest in the way that the best doctors can be honest about how much she had initially dismissed. "I was wrong to be as certain as I was," she told Malcolm one afternoon. "Not about the diagnosis was accurate, but about what was possible. I conflated, we don't have a method for this. with no method exists. Those aren't the same thing. Malcolm thought about that for a long time afterward. He thought about it when he watched Callum squeeze his hand. When Callum began speaking again, first single words, then halting sentences, then longer, the gaps slowly closing the way ice on a lake, slowly thins at the edges in spring. When the physiotherapist came and Callum cursed under his breath, trying to lift his arm, and Malcolm had to bite down on a smile because the sound of his son frustrated and present and alive was the best thing he'd ever heard. Simone visited every week. She and Callum developed the particular friendship that sometimes forms between very different people who've been brought together by circumstances neither of them chose. A little awkward at first, then gradually comfortable, then something real. He taught her the rules of hockey with the missionary zeal of a devoted fan. She told him about her grandmother's village in Guyana, and what the plants looked like there and the things they could do. He listened with the openness of a child whose mind had been, in some sense, remade. Malcolm and Claudette's relationship was more complicated. It couldn't be otherwise. The distance between their lives was significant and real, and neither of them pretended it wasn't. But something had happened in room 14B that changed the way he saw things, and he was not the kind of man who ignored evidence, even when the evidence was about himself. He made an offer. He was careful about how he made it, aware of what Claudette had said to him in the cafeteria, aware that she would refuse anything that felt like charity or purchase. He proposed funding for a formal documentation project. Claudette, and a small team of her choosing, compensated properly, to record and organize her mother's methods alongside relevant medical literature. A foundation operated independently, entirely under Claudette's direction. Not his foundation, hers. She took 3 weeks to consider it. She consulted people he never met. She came back with conditions and modifications, some of which surprised him, and he agreed to all of them. It wasn't a transaction, or it was trying, with some effort, not to be one. Callum was discharged in April. He came home to Malcolm's house in West Vancouver, which had always been slightly too large and too quiet for one person and which was suddenly, startlingly, full of sound again. He walked slowly. He tired easily. He had occupational therapy 3 times a week and speech therapy twice a week, and a physiotherapy session on Saturdays that he complained about with the specific and creative resentment that Malcolm found, privately, wonderful. He would be in recovery for months more, perhaps longer. There would be setbacks. Dr. Osei had been honest about that, and Malcolm had appreciated her honesty even when it was hard to hear. But he was home. He was in the kitchen asking where the cereal was kept. He was in the living room arguing about which team would make the playoffs. He was incompletely and imperfectly and magnificently himself. On a Sunday afternoon in late April, Claudette brought Simone for a visit. They sat on the back deck while Callum and Simone argued companionably about something Malcolm couldn't follow, and Claudette drank her tea and looked out at the water. "Your mother," Malcolm said after a while, "did she know? When she was developing these methods, did she know what she was actually doing?" Neurologically, Claudette considered this. She knew what she observed. She knew what worked. She wasn't concerned with the scientific explanation. She used to say that the healing doesn't wait for the theory to catch up. Malcolm nodded. Below them, Callum was demonstrating a hockey grip to Simone using a broom he'd found somewhere, moving his arm with careful deliberateness, still building back what had been lost. Simone watched with her characteristic attention, and then she wrapped her own hands around the broom handle where he showed her, and she laughed at something he said. It was such an ordinary thing. A girl laughing in the afternoon light. Malcolm did not know how to express, in any language he'd ever spoken, what it meant to be sitting here watching this. He'd spent his whole life measuring value. Returns, outcomes, quantifiable results. He had never found a number for this. "Thank you," he said to Claudette. It was insufficient. He said it anyway. She nodded, looking out at the water. "Thank Simone," she said. "She's the one who trusted you enough to say something." Malcolm looked at his son, laughing on the back deck with a broomstick, and a girl who had walked into his life from an orange vinyl chair in a hospital hallway. He thought about blocked paths and new ones, about the things we think we know and the things we only think we know. About an 11-year-old with careful eyes and an old book and a grandmother's wisdom she carried, like something sacred, because it was. There were things, he understood now, that no amount of money had ever bought him access to. Things that existed in a different economy entirely. One built on attention, on trust, on the willingness to be taught by someone you'd been conditioned to overlook. Callum looked up from the deck and caught his father watching and rolled his eyes with the magnificent, healthy, glorious exasperation of a 12-year-old who has noticed he is being observed. "Dad," he called. "Stop staring. It's weird." Malcolm laughed. Actually laughed, from somewhere uncomplicated and real. "Sorry," he called back. He wasn't sorry at all.